In this video, we're painting a landscape. Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Bridget and I'm an artist and art educator. For this tutorial, we are using acrylic paint. I am painting on a canvas paper, but you can paint on a canvas proper. For the main sky color, I'm using an ultramarine blue mixed with some white, and then I'm painting while it's still wet right on top of it with some white on a round brush. And I'm painting over those white streaks several times just to fan them out, to blend them out, and to make them look more fluffy, like they're far off in the distance clouds. It's important to do this while the paint is still wet, just to avoid any chicken scratch effect where you get that really rough texture looking. We want to keep it nice and smooth, and the best way to do this is to use wet paint on top of a wet paint layer. And to keep my lines nice and thin, giving the impression that the clouds are very far away, I'm using a very light hand and focusing on the tip of my brush to get that first line down. And then I add just a little bit more pressure with a clean brush just to fan out those lines. So I'm painting from a reference photo that I took, and on that day where I took this picture, the clouds made this really cool line, like just one line of clouds. So I'm recreating that right near the horizon line where the sky stops and where the water will eventually start. And I'm holding my paintbrush sort of parallel to the paper, and then I'm just dabbing ever so lightly just to get that nice cloud shape and to get several of them. So using a teal color, just so you know, if you ever paint water, start with green or like a greeny blue, and then you will get a more realistic effect. So I'm using this turquoise teal color, and then I'm adding a little bit of white to create the waves and to add some texture to the water. And I'm working really quickly because acrylic paint dries really quickly, and I want the paint to still be wet, so that way I can blend it out and to have those variety of shades within the waves. And for this sand color, I've added a little bit of white to raw umber, and I'm placing that down everywhere where I want the sand to be. And if I want to keep my edges clean, I go a little bit slower, and then I fill in the rest very quickly. So for the sand, I'm using a similar technique that I did with the water, but this time I'm doing a little dabbing motion with the white on top of the wet paint beneath it. And this way I can create the impression that there are footprints or that the sand has been walked on. And I'm doing the same thing with a little bit of darker raw umber. And this will create some shadows. And as you can see, the more dabs that I do, the lighter it gets, which is totally fine. That's what I want. So now I'm creating some rocks that look out onto the water. And I'm doing that by taking some light gray and just outlining where those larger rocks are. And then I'm going to do some dabbing motion for the smaller rocks that surround it. I don't know if you have this where you live, but where I live, we have a lot of these sort of rock partitions or like rocky parts that keep the water at bay. This is like rocks that you can walk out onto and look out onto the water from. And I'm still using this round brush, and that way I can really create the shape that I want for these rocks. But you might want to use a more square brush like the one I'm using here for those tippy highlights of the waves. And I'm holding my brush straight up and down to the paper just to get that tip of the brush and to create those thin lines, creating waves that are farther away. Now taking a big dry brush, I've dipped it into just a little bit of that dark raw umber, and I'm just doing some dabbing motions to create little sand speckles. Now I'm taking a thin brush with some dark gray, and I'm going into the crevices in between the rocks just to create some shadows. Another way to paint these rocks would be to start off with the darker color first and then gradually get lighter. But this way you can still do it, you would just have to blend out those colors like I'm doing. And because this is a small area, I'm using a very small brush to get into these places and to blend them out. And I'm working while the paint is still wet, that way it's easy to blend. I placed the highlights or lighter parts of the rock near the top where I would imagine the light would hit them. And then I'm using the darker colors, the darker grays and blacks even, for those parts that are in between each rocks just to define them. And I encourage you to experiment with the way that you hold your paintbrush. You'll find that you'll be able to create different shapes depending on how you hold it and how much pressure you use. I'm beginning this small tree that is blowing in the wind just by starting off with its trunk. And then my camera died, but I made the leaves with a small paintbrush and a dabbing effect. And to define the rocks more, I took an artist pen and I just defined the shape of the rocks a bit better. If you like this video or learned something, give it a like. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments and then subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for watching.